politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, the place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Doing?
I'm doing okay today. How about you?
I'm good. It's Saturday. I'm feeling good today.
Yeah. Before we get started with the show, I had just a brief message for folks. If you are a supporter of the show at the $10 a month or higher level on Patreon, you've got either a Politics Guy mug or a tote bag coming your way that, if you want one, that is, I always hate it when people send out that stuff that I don't want. And sometimes I just say, can I just not get something? So, you know what I mean? But anyway, I think they're both pretty cool. So if you want one, I'll send that to you. And I was getting ready to send them out when I realized that for most folks, I didn't know whether they wanted the mug or the tote bag or neither, and there's no way, as far as I can tell, to set things up in Patreon to have people choose an option. So what I did is I recently sent out messages to everyone who's entitled to get that mug or tote bag. And so if you want either of them, just let me know. And if you'd rather not respond through Patreon, you can just email me your preference along with a mailing address if you didn't already provide one in Patreon. And again, my email address is mike@politicsguys.com. So there you go. All right. That does it for the housekeeping stuff. So I think we are ready to go, Kristen, if you want to kick us off.
We are. So I think it's pretty obvious what the first story will be this week. It's no surprise that we're going to talk about the immigration deal that was brokered between the U.S. and Mexico earlier this week. So after months of back and forth, it feels like it was years, but it was months. President Trump announced last Friday that the U.S. and Mexico had finally reached a deal. And this is, of course, after he threatened to implement these punitive tariffs that would have begun this past Monday, but Mexico avoided those tariffs by entering into this deal. And the details of the deal, which were only just widely reported Friday, the provisions included a side agreement that called for burden sharing and the assignment of responsibility for processing refugee claims from migrants. And this is part of a regional approach to tackling a rise in Central American migration to the U.S. And of course, as part of this agreement, if the U.S. determines after its discretion, after consultation with Mexico, 45 days that the measures adopted by Mexico haven't sufficiently reached the results in addressing the flow of U.S. migrants to the U.S. southern border, Mexico will take all necessary steps under domestic law to bring the agreement into force. So it's a bit hairy there, and of course, the clock is ticking, and all eyes are on Mexico. So, what do you think, Mike?
Well, I think it's an interesting example of, outsourcing our border security to Mexico.
Yeah.
So, that's obviously the kind of glib way to look at it, but I think we're expecting an awful lot from Mexico here.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest part of this, it seems to me, that, or at least the part that a lot of folks are focusing on, is that Mexico taking 6,000 National Guard forces, at which, by the way, Mexico's National Guard, brand new thing. It was only approved by Mexico's Congress in March of 2019. So this isn't like an existing body. And they're supposed to go essentially to the border with Guatemala, which is a pretty long border, over 540 miles, lots of rough kind of jungle, areas. Mexico's never made any concerted attempt to secure this border. And to put this in perspective, we've spent years, decades, and billions of dollars securing our border with Mexico, and we have huge problems. And I think expecting Mexico to do big things with a brand new force on a border they haven't really worked on securing in 45 days is completely unrealistic. That's not to say that, some progress can't be made, but if we're expecting this surge of migrants to slow to a trickle in 45 days, I think that's incredibly overly optimistic, especially because you think about it, let's say that Mexico even magically manages to halt most of the flow from the Central American countries at that Guatemalan border. Well, there's still that lag time because people have to go all the way across Mexico to get to the United States, and these people are traveling largely on foot. So I'm wondering if that 45 days thing is maybe more of a kind of a public relations sort of thing. At least I hope it is, because expecting that and saying, well, the flow hasn't slowed appreciably, so we're going to lay down these tariffs. I don't think that that's a very smart or realistic goal.
Yeah, I agree with you on that front. 45 days seems a little short. I mean, I think that, there's been a lot of back and forth about the tariffs being too punitive, this undue pressure being put on Mexico. I think in this case it worked to the ends, at least, that President Trump wanted them to work. But I think 40 days is pretty unrealistic. If you have any knowledge about the crisis at the border, immigration, how the process works. I mean, like you mentioned, this is a fairly new concept. I mean, even Mexico has said weeks back, and I think they even were talking about months ago, that they just didn't have the resources to be able to do this, to be able to help on their front. So, I think that they've had concerns about it. I think this was sort of a panicked attempt to, avoid these tariffs. And I actually understand why the tariffs were threatened. And I think actually that this is sort of in line with the way Trump does things. I mean, this is a guy, he's a businessman, and he's used to conveying, his ideas and exerting power through force. And this is another way to do that. And I can understand why, Republicans, of which I am one, why he did it. But I also think that the 45-day thing is unrealistic. I mean, this is a wait and see, but I do hope that they allow for a little bit of extra time there, because there will be a lag. And of course, I don't know, in light of the fact that I think it was $4.5 billion that President Trump asked for back in May for the border. I mean, this should, I think, satisfy some of the concerns on the right about, just exerting, maybe Mexico taking up part of the burden will help allay some of those fears of spending money. I know that was my primary concern, but will it work? I don't know.
Yeah, well, in terms of just the strategy, obviously, a lot of Republicans even were very upset with even the threat of that, because, of course, Mexico is the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and this would have implications in the tens of billions of dollars if this kind of goes through. And I think they're right about that, because the problem here, and this is, I think, true for a lot of the things that President Trump does, is they make sense in the short term. If you try to strong arm people, sovereign countries, that makes sense maybe short term if you're playing kind of a single iteration game. But in the long term, when international relations are built on trust and this belief that there are certain things that you will and won't do, this has some pretty long-term implications. I don't get the sense that President Trump really thinks about these long-term implications, but I think it's troublesome. Also, I think just the very the authority for President Trump to do this is through, of course, his national emergency declaration. Now, specifically, he invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and there are a lot of different powers that the president has once he declares a national emergency. And so to me, I feel like I think Congress needs to step back. And this could be done in a sense in a bipartisan way. Maybe I'm dreaming, but it's impossible, I think, to define what an emergency is. That's going to be fairly subjective. But I think what we could do is change the National Emergencies Act to maybe not define an emergency, but to perhaps sunset presidential declarations after, say, a month or 2 months. Because I think if we think about what the rationale behind this is, I agree with the rationale saying if there is an emergency and there's not time for Congress to deliberate an act, it makes sense to give the president that power. And I'm absolutely for that. But it's not intended as a way for the president to go around Congress to act unilaterally. And
Right.
that, to me, that's what President Trump is doing. I don't think that was the legislative intent, and I also don't think it's very good for, just more generally, separation of powers in Congress as a co-equal, in fact, the first branch. So I would love to see legislation that moved in that direction, though I don't expect that would, I don't see that getting through the Senate, certainly.
No, and I think and I've mentioned this before on the show that whoever happens to be the president, I think that the party sort of lines up behind whatever emergency declarations they're making, and obviously in this case, I do understand. I follow what you're saying 100%, and I agree with you 100% actually about. The fact that the president should have this power, especially if we're dealing with a situation that's deemed a crisis, for example. And of course, you have, DHS, and you've got these border security officials saying that the flow has recently reached this crisis level, which in the past they had not said that. They kept saying it's nearing, it's a threat, and now they're saying it's reaching crisis. Now, again, that's subjective. In their eyes, they're dealing with it on the ground level. And I will go ahead and say that I've never been to the border. I'm not dealing with this on a daily basis. I don't know. Most of us don't know. But this is what they're saying. And so the president has a responsibility to act on their behalf. And I understand that. But I think that the idea of sunsetting, an executive order like this would be wise, because I think it would give everything a chance to play out. And if Congress, we have a difficult situation. We have a bit of gridlock with Congress and the president right now. But if they're hopefully, and I hope, and upon I don't know what, that if Congress sees that this is doing some good, and that Mexico is holding up their end of the bargain, we've stemmed the flow, there aren't further complications, I hope that they would act in the best interest of the country, again, in a bipartisan way, and back the president on this if he was right. I don't know if he will be. But,
I think one reason why there are a number of reasons why I'm not super hopeful. And one of these that I haven't mentioned yet is that, in a way, Congress likes letting the president do these things because then it can wash its hand of the responsibility. Now, Congress, because if there was some kind of a sunset thing, then all of a sudden there would be a crisis that Congress would have to act to solve. But now they can just say, well, the president is doing these things, and while I don't approve of it, our hands are tied and he's doing this and that sort of thing. So Congress doesn't want, I think in many cases, the responsibility of making these tough choices. And in making these tough choices, it means that you have to compromise. And that's one thing we're not seeing any attempt at, as far as I can tell, is all the involved parties getting together to try to craft some sort of legislative fix.
No, you're not. And another thing is you have, so many Democratic presidential candidates who've, declared their candidacy. They're sitting in Congress right now. And, they would use this as an opportunity to grandstand, would be my fear, is that they would use this as an opportunity to not necessarily fix something that's, according to DHS and border security officials, a crisis at the border, something that really could be a real issue that we have to fix now. And instead of, they would use that for personal gain or political gain. And from a policy perspective, it irritates me beyond belief.
I get it. I mean, I don't think anyone, well, I won't say that, but it seems to me patently obvious that we have a big problem with our asylum system. When you have a system where, 80-something% of the people who apply not only have to wait years in many cases to get a decision, but those decisions are, no, you don't qualify for asylum under our law. I mean, the base issue, it seems to me, is that we need to change how that system works, what qualifies as asylum, and how to expedite that process so it's a matter of weeks, not years, to make that decision. And until we deal with that, I don't see these other problems going away.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that our laws in this country sort of allow for people to come across the border or to come into this country and at least try to claim asylum no matter what, which is not the case in a lot of other countries.
Right.
And so I think, maybe from an outsider's perspective, I'm not an outsider, but from an outsider's perspective, as somebody who knows a lot of people who immigrated here, I live in a community full of immigrants who were seeking asylum. And, a lot of these people view it as sort of as an opportunity and not really, a process. And I think maybe we need to cut back some of the red tape on that process. Like you said, I'm just not sure that we have the answer yet. I'm not sure I've heard it.
No,
it seems like we can't make up our minds.
I agree. And some people in the last few weeks have been talking about so-called safe third country agreements, basically
Right.
that asylum seekers would have to apply for asylum in the first country they arrive in. Now, the U.S. actually has one of these with Canada. It doesn't really come into play a whole heck of a lot for understandable reasons. I think it would be a lot tougher in the Mexican situation. I mean, Mexico actually, especially in some of these areas, is not so safe for Mexicans. Their murder rate is at an all-time high. It went up something like 33% from 2017. It's pretty awful, but it's only awful when you compare it to, say, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which are way, way worse. But so basically, these people who are applying for asylum, I mean, having them stay in Mexico is maybe marginally better. Now, that also imposes a lot of costs on Mexico, and the State Department actually is willing to step in a little bit. They're saying they have tens of millions of dollars to support asylum seekers staying in Mexico. That's different from the safe third party thing. That's part of that MPP program, which recently it's been at around 250 people a day who are just applying for asylum in the U.S., but they wait in Mexico. And I think under this agreement, it's going to go up to around 1,000 people per day. And that's obviously, again, that might be a decent stopgap, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem. And what bugs me, and I know it bugs you too, is that we have these ultra short policy windows to deal with these things. And we both know that nothing's going to happen before the elections now. And so we have this window, maybe depending on what happens in November of 2020, we have this window maybe of 6 months from January of 2021 up until the summer for something to get done. And isn't it sad that we've come to a place where that's basically our policy window for doing stuff is, 6 to 8 months out of a 4-year cycle. That's depressing.
It is. I think bringing up the humanitarian aspect of it is important, even though, and I will go on the record criticizing some of my fellow conservatives and Republicans and say that sometimes we neglect that humanitarian aspect of it. And maybe I'm a bit more sensitive to it because of where I live. And, because some of my very best friends are people who, a lot of Venezuelans, Cubans. I live in South Florida. I mean, I'm surrounded by it. These people are dealing with more than most of us could imagine, more than I could imagine, in their home countries and what they're escaping. And while I think that can't be the sole focus, and I will go on the record again and criticize Democrats for making that the sole focus, pulling at the heartstrings sort of a thing. I don't think that that's it. We have our own interests in this country. We have financial interests, and we have to worry about, creating these other crises, for future generations to clean up. But, we have to have an eye on that humanitarian aspect of it. I mean, where do we put these people? Back in May, there was, I think it was a $4.3 billion dump of money into this emergency fund that President Trump asked for, and the overwhelming bulk of that money, I think it was $3.3 billion, was allotted to just for humanitarian causes.
Yeah, right.
Where that went, I don't know. There's a lot of conjecture, but that's a lot of money that we're just sort of pouring into the border for helping. And are we really fixing the problem? No. And maybe that money, and we've mentioned this before when we've talked on this podcast, but, maybe that money would be better spent or I would say less of that money would be better spent. Maybe we'd all be better off if we're, putting money into housing these people elsewhere, and we're trying to fix humanitarian problems elsewhere. It's a lot less expensive. The burden is a lot less on the United States. It could be, if we could figure out the secret formula, it could really be a win-win. But, again, I haven't heard that.
No. And I mean, walls are stopgap solutions at best. They don't address that. And so I think any sort of a solution is going to have to involve both sides making significant concessions, and that's just not something we're seeing at this point.
Nope. And it's not going to happen in the next year,
No,
it's just not.
Not at all.
All right. So I guess, should we move on to the next story?
Yeah, let's do that.
We have a lot to cover. So the next story is everything that's been going on in the Gulf of Oman and with Iran, and of course tensions escalating there. So this is one that just sort of started gaining traction as the week came to a close. So if you were watching the news last night, or maybe Thursday, you heard about this. On Thursday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated that the U.S. government assessed that Iran was responsible for attacks on 2 tankers that took place in the Gulf of Oman earlier that day. And he claimed that the assessment was based on the following: intelligence, weapons used, and the level of expertise needed to execute the attack. And I should also note that recently Iran was pinpointed in attacks on other shipping vessels in the area, and said that the situation is one of escalating tension in the area. So it's a bit of a cloud of mystery.
Yeah.
So what's your take, Mike?
Well, I don't have any trouble believing that Iran is behind this. I mean, I saw, like so many people, that sort of grainy video, and I don't know. I mean,
Very grainy.
I mean, so it's guys in a ship taking something off of guys in a boat taking something off of a ship. I don't know. So, sure, given Iran's past behavior, I don't have any problems believing that. But to me, the bigger issue is, this points to the fact that, in a way, President Trump's strategy is, and I'll air quote it, working here. I mean, since we pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, which we pulled out of not because Iran was in violation of it, but because essentially the Trump administration felt that they could get a better deal than the Obama administration negotiated. And I think the calculation was that we could cause enough economic pain to force Iran to come back to the negotiating table and give us more than they gave the Obama administration. Would you say that's more or less?
Oh, definitely. Accurate? Definitely. And this is a pattern. I mean, we just talked about this regarding Mexico and the punitive tariffs. Exactly. I mean, this is his MO,
So here's my question on this is, this is a gamble, obviously, that we can kind of force Iran into submission. So, of course, this makes sense what we believe Iran is doing, because they're lashing out because they don't want to submit, obviously. They want to make a point about the importance of the oil supply and what they can do in retaliation and so forth. But here's my concern is I'm wondering if, it's one thing to play hardball. It's another thing to back people into a corner. And one of the things I think we sometimes don't give enough consideration to, this just isn't true with Iran, but it's true with dealings with a lot of other countries, is what's their domestic politics situation look like? I mean, in Iran, what can the hardliners allow? I mean, what are they able to give up? And I think you could reasonably argue that the Iran deal that the Trump administration pulled out of was a huge concession for these hardliners. That might have been as much as their politics could bear. And so pushing them even further might have the unintended consequence of actually just making things worse. And I don't know if that's the situation. It sure feels that way to me, but I don't think that we're sensitive enough to the nuances of their domestic politics, because their system isn't like ours. And these hardliners have a ton of power. And it was kind of a major lift to even get them to agree to inspections and pulling back on their program and so forth. And so now, not only do we have problems with Iran here, but of course, the larger issue is, well, if we have an administration that says we're going to make deals, But if we see we have an opportunity to get a better deal by exerting some leverage, we don't have a problem pulling out of anything and making a better deal. And again, like you mentioned, and like I mentioned before, that might make a lot of sense in the very short term, but longer term, that's a huge problem, I think.
I agree with that. One thing that I have had many conversations just regarding the geopolitical realm and, our involvement with the Middle East. While I have always been very supportive of some of it, I think that one of the shortcomings of the United States, this idea of foreign policy in the Middle East, and again, this has been expressed so many times and it's been ignored so many times, is that we, like you said, we have no idea, we have no concept of how their systems work. And it goes so far, it goes into the culture, it seeps into the society, the way that their worldview, it is completely different. I mean, they are on another planet when it comes to political structure. And it's something that I know, I listened to the Serial podcast. I don't know if you listen to the Serial podcast. It was kind of the granddaddy, but yeah, but season 2, which was the Bo Bergdahl season, I was struck all the time by these military officials coming on and repeating this over and over again. We have no idea what their system is about. That's not saying that we should pull out and never, forego all of our interests. But when it comes to something like this, I think it's important to look at history and see how we've done things and what has worked. And while clearly what we have done in the past regarding Iran has never completely worked, in the 1980s, and I think it was like the late 80s, 86, 87, we have sort of a repeat in a lot of ways of what was happening now, with a few exceptions, where Iran was attacking these tankers of neutral countries that were suspected of carrying, I think, oil from Iraq. And this was, when there were tensions between Iraq and Iran, which, it's ongoing. And I think it's interesting that President Reagan at the time was also criticized for handling things in an odd way. But what he did that President Trump is not doing, and this is something that it's not really a criticism of President Trump, it's just a hope for what I personally hope he does, is Reagan did a great job of unifying the world and a lot of our ally countries into sort of this unified response against the aggression of Iran. And he was able to protect these tankers. He was able to utilize the Navy. And so we sort of avoided a bigger conflict. And I thought that was smart. I mean, did it work entirely? No, but it was pretty close. And so I would hope that President Trump, again, I've said this before and I've been happy about what he's done. I've been disappointed, but I would hope that moving forward, because he's really given no details, but I would hope that he would try to get other countries on board and that he would utilize power in this way and as almost like a protective thing. And I do believe that he should protect American interests and he should protect the interests of our allies. I'm totally on board with that. Yeah. But I mean, there are just so many things to consider.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And one of the things I admired about President George H.W. Bush is that he was a big believer in protecting American interests, but in doing it in a way where you got that sort of international coalition, and it was a real coalition, not just, we grab a couple countries here and there who we can, that sort of thing. But yeah, absolutely. The other aspect of this, I think, is, of course, the president's all-in with Saudi Arabia strategy in the Middle East. And of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two main contending powers there. And, this relates also to the fact of the administration's ongoing support of Saudi Arabia's side in the civil war in Yemen. And of course, there are a number of members of Congress, including conservative members of Congress, who voted against, in fact, the majority voted against our continuing support for the war. And there was a recent big arms sale to Saudi Arabia. And, that it looks like that the Congress, both chambers, are going to express a resolution of disapproval. They're going to essentially, nullify that. Then the president's going to veto it, and there aren't going to be the votes for an override, that sort of thing. And so I think the president would be in his best interest and in the country's best interest if he listened to the what's somewhat of a bipartisan consensus out of Congress. And again, certainly we need to stick up for American interests, strategic interests, but we need to do so in a way that doesn't damage us in the longer term. And I think that this sort of very force first, and that's the only tool in the toolbox, and we're just these are our friends and these are our enemies. It's just not how it works, I don't think.
No, I joke around with some of my kind of other libertarian-leaning Republican friends that Rand Paul is sort of the Trump whisperer in a lot of ways. I know they play golf, and when it comes to a lot of these geopolitical issues, these things that go beyond our understanding, I think I'm willing to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt on certain things. I think the muscle works from time to time, and I think it works in the short term. And I think I actually think that what was going on in Mexico was a win for now. I think it could be a win later on, but I think it was a win for now. And in this situation, regarding the arms sales to Saudi Arabia, I think that Trump would be wise to listen to people like the Trump whisperer, Rand Paul, and maybe back away from it a little bit, because I think there are some legitimate fears that those weapons are going into the hands of militias. I mean, I don't even think it's a fear. It's an actuality. I mean, that this is what's happening with these weapons, and we've run into this problem again and again. And while I welcome this change from this Obama administration era of sort of this, this like cautious optimism and this more hands-off approach. I think it's working. I think he would be wise to use a little bit of restraint, but he's not the most restrained guy.
No. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think force can be a useful tool, but if it's the only tool in your toolbox, you're not going to be nearly as effective as if you use it judiciously.
Right. I totally agree.
So now we actually have some domestic politics to talk about, right?
Yeah, a little bit this week. So a couple of interesting things going on, but the first is up in Washington, a House panel voted to hold Attorney General William Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross in contempt of Congress for withholding documents on plans to add this is the citizenship question to the 2020 census. That's been kind of an on and off hot topic. Haven't heard as much about it in a while. So this is the first I've, kind of a resurgence of this. This happened on Wednesday. President Donald Trump exerted executive privilege over the material. And then the Oversight and Reform Committee voted on Wednesday for the civil contempt resolution, which gives Democratic Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings the option to file a lawsuit to enforce the panel subpoenas for the documents. And that vote was 24-15. So it was pretty decided to hold them in contempt. But overall, pretty interesting because the chairman of that committee, Elijah Cummings, is a fairly controversial figure, and he is far from, he's pretty partisan. And, there are, of course, allegations that he's using this as as all politicians do. I hate this idea that, that they somehow will rise above and not be partisan and use this for 2020 gain. But that's, there's a lot of criticism that that's what he's doing. And of course, all this is going to be decided later on at the end of the month in front of the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Well, it might. I mean, because there was also this week, the ACLU asked the Supreme Court to hold off on ruling on this, given the new information about that Republican operative who supposedly was instrumental in crafting the whole citizenship question thing. And so the ACLU's argument is basically this is significant new evidence that the court didn't hear, it didn't get in its briefs and didn't hear in the oral arguments. And so therefore they should essentially kick it back down to a lower court to rule, or they can rule against it. The ACLU would be fine with that, certainly. Right. But so I think there are a couple of things going on here. First, there's obviously just the question about the census. And the reason I'm sure you'll agree why this is such a big deal is once the census is done, it's done. And that's it for a decade. You can't correct. And there's no redo on the census. You can't correct the miscount or an undercount. And of course, it affects tens of billions of dollars in federal funding and apportionment for the next entire decade. So that's one big part of it. And it's not going to surprise you, I'm sure, that it seems to me that based on the evidence I've seen, that there absolutely was a partisan goal in doing this. And to me, the biggest issue with this, kind of the big structural issue with this is we only do a census once every 10 years. Now, why do we do that? Well, because it says so in the Constitution. And that's not necessarily the best reason to do something for over 200 years. And so I did a little digging. Now, the 2020 census is supposed to cost around $15.6 billion, which, okay, to you and me might sound like a lot. But
Yeah.
that's like 0.3% of the budget.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, for $15.6 billion, it's only one aircraft carrier and a couple of subs. So, not exactly couch cushion change, but what would happen? What would happen if we moved to every 5 years for the census? I mean, not a big increase in cost, but all of a sudden, the political stakes are a whole lot lower because we can make these corrections. And now it's not, half of a generation where congressional districts are locked in. I don't know that's not that seems to me to be maybe a reasonable thing at least to consider, because as long as the stakes are going to be this high, it's going to be politicized. And if we can't depoliticize these things, and I don't think we can, maybe the thing to do is try to make the stakes a little bit lower so we don't have so much of this rushing into it.
This is a really random question, but has anyone ever even brought that up, Mike? Did you come across that? Because I have never heard of that. It's really interesting.
It just kind of came to me because I was trying to, I try as much as I can to say, how can I get past sort of the partisan surface thing and look at what's driving it? And, that just kind of came to me late in the week. And so I'm sure there have been some proposals, but it seems to me that might be a way to lower the stakes at least a little bit. That doesn't answer the question before us now. And of course, I'll be very interested in hearing what the court says. And my sense is they're going to rule, and they're going to rule, in my view, incorrectly. But we'll talk about that when it happens. But, the other thing, obviously, big fundamental issue is this interbranch conflict, right, between the Congress's legitimate authority to issue subpoenas and get information to do legitimate legislative things. And then, of course, the Trump administration responded by claiming executive privilege. And that's a legitimate thing as well. And this is difficult because, people just want to take sides and say, well, the administration's right or the House Democrats are right. But if you take a look at it and how the courts basically ruled on this in the past, they said, these are both legitimate conflicting interests. And so we want to stay out of it as much as possible. And in general, the court's expectation is that both sides will make a good faith effort to compromise. And we've actually seen a little bit of that because Barr gave up more of the information on the Mueller investigation due to this sort of a compromise. And now that's what the courts are going to want, and they're going to be reluctant to step in unless they see that sort of thing. And I think rightly so, because when we look at the decisions courts have reached on this, they haven't been sweeping. They've been very kind of case specific because this is so subjective, and it really depends a lot on the specifics of the case here. And so my hope is that we'll see the same sort of compromise in this as we've seen between Barr and House Democrats. Now, that's going to mean that both sides are going to be a little unhappy with the results, but that's, I think, how this has to work out, unless you just want the courts to impose a decision on you. And I don't think that's good in the long run for anyone.
No, I think you touched on something so important that I had actually put on my paper and highlighted. And that's, this point that I keep driving home on just about every issue that we talk about on this podcast and that I talk about in my life. And that's the fact that I think a lot of people in the United States don't realize that just because something suits their own interests, their own political motivations, and it sort of aligns with their ideas, or because the news is telling you that it does, that doesn't mean that it's not still politically motivated. And I think it's important to remember you always have to look through that lens of 2020, 2022, 2024. This is the way that politicians think. And I say this as somebody who's worked with them time and time again on every level for many years. They're not thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. They're thinking about what's going to, are they going to get reelected? It's very personal for them, and it affects their policy. And I think, when you're dealing with something like this, I understand, and you beautifully summarize sort of the issues that the Supreme Court will face eventually whenever they get to it, if they listen to the ACLU. But, they're facing this issue of what does executive privilege trump, these powers of Congress and vice versa. But, something that's so important to remember is that both sides have political stakes here. And a lot of times there's this sort of Monday morning quarterbacking going on to, where one side will come forward and say like, oh, this is, what we want to happen. And then they'll come up with a rationale later,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Like say it and then explain it later on. And I think that both sides have done a really good job of doing this and to presenting their argument, but after the fact. So, on the right, you have, people like Bill Barr and Wilbur Ross saying that this is all this is essential for enforcing the Voter Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is, I understand the rationale entirely, but it does feel a little bit like Monday morning quarterbacking. Of course, we all know this is all politically motivated. They see this as a potential win. But this is the what they're inserting into it. And of course, this gives Democrats the opportunity to do the exact same thing. And I think we overlook that. A lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats on both sides tend to just automatically side with, whoever's up there on their side and, shouting about the other side. And we have to take a step back and look at it. And again, this is one of those things that's going to play out, but it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules. And I also think that they will probably rule in favor of the citizenship question. But again, I have to say, we really need to research that idea of the census every 5 years. That I don't think I've ever come across it. That's really interesting.
I'd like to think every once in a while, maybe I can have, whenever I have what I think is an original idea, I just assume I haven't researched enough because somebody else came up with it.
No, it's
maybe
logical.
It's at least original-ish. I don't know. But, before we move on, there is one other thing I wanted to bring up in thinking about this and reading about this. President Trump's attorneys say that the House Democrats have issued over 100 subpoenas and related requests for information. And so I thought to myself, well, okay, number one, is that accurate? I don't know. Number two, is it a lot? Because I was thinking, well, yeah. I recall the Republican-controlled House issuing a lot of subpoenas to the Obama administration. And so I went on a search, and I could not find anyone anywhere who has any sort of a overtime log of this. Because I think that, that's pretty important. Is this unusual activity by House Democrats? And now you might say, well, even if it is, it's because the Trump administration is unusually corrupt or potentially corrupt, and I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint. But it was frustrating to me this week because I wanted better data to go on to try to make some sort of decent comparisons, and it just wasn't there. And I think the reason why it just wasn't there is that's not the kind of thing that's very interesting or headline grabbing. Here's a 20-year retrospective analysis of the number of subpoenas that House committees issue to the executive branch. I know
it's a little wonky for most people. Maybe it would be interesting though. Yeah.
I mean, it's super important to me in making these arguments about whether somebody is overstepping and being too partisan or whatever that means. But that's the kind of information that can be, I think, very important, but so hard to get it. I almost thought to myself, well, maybe this would be a good academic paper for me to write before I remembered that I just absolutely hate writing academic papers. But that's a whole nother story. You get an audience of like 20 people, But anyway.
If I go for my PhD, maybe I'll go ahead and write that.
There you go. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that point up there before he moved on.
Yeah, I also have to bring up a quick point. It's funny because more and more, and this began in the Obama administration. I would hear about this back and forth going on, stuff like this executive privilege and this, outcry from the right about executive privilege and back and forth. And I'm seeing it going on even more now with President Trump. I think it's less because of corruption and more just because of over this overly politicized environment we're living in. There's so much hatred, and I think there's just this, this sort of viciousness going on both sides to just outdo the other, no matter how small. And it's funny because when I read Democratic Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings, I thought, well, of course he did that, and
Right.
and then of course this is how Trump is responding. I mean, it's almost comical in a lot of ways. We're dealing with these people who have kind of become caricatures of themselves, and I can almost anticipate. I don't know about you; it's kind of a side note, but I can almost anticipate what they're going to say and do at this point.
Yeah, no,
I mean,
absolutely,
it's just
absolutely.
it's rather disheartening.
Which is why I think it was so surprising when Justin Amash came out and
sure,
he was one of the people who voted for the contempt citation, and I mean we rarely see that anymore, that kind of breaking of ranks on something like that. And of course he's been obviously on the right. There's a lot of kind of drumming him out, and I think he just recently announced that he's going to be quitting the House Freedom Caucus. They probably just locked him out of the meetings and all that kind of thing.
He was part of that little triumvirate trio that it's disheartening for me because I really loved Justin Amash. I really thought that he was somebody who I appreciated, even though I didn't always agree with him. I appreciated that he towed the line for freedom, and he was part of that Massey, Paul, Amash. I mean, they were kind of this little Three Musketeers for a long time. So I'm sure that they convinced him to remove himself. So
and it is too bad because I talk about Rand Paul. He's by far my more favorite of the two Kentucky senators. I won't go on one of my normal Mitch McConnell rants, but
he's my favorite too. So
the thing with Rand Paul is, while I disagree with him on a lot, I get the sense that he takes a non-trivial percentage of his positions based on some actual principle as opposed to what's my team want. And I can at least respect that, even if I don't agree with it, So
definitely. So shall we move on?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we have a couple of news stories that are coming straight out of the White House. Actually, this week, more domestic things going on. White House. The first thing is with White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders. So as most of you probably know, she's decided to step down from her duties. And this was announced by President Trump this past Thursday on his favorite platform for making those types of announcements, which is Twitter. Sanders is only the third woman to have held the post, which as a woman I find a little disheartening again. But and she served for nearly 2 years as and then before that she was the deputy press secretary, so she was elevated to that position. And her rationale, Sanders says that she's leaving to head home with her family, and the president has wished her well. And I did a little bit of research here because I find myself, I talk to my husband a lot about, jobs, in the White House. And he brought up the question the other day, well, how long do White House press secretaries typically serve? Because I feel like there's such a high turnover. And I thought, there really is. And I looked it up and I saw there were multiple numbers that I saw, but everything seemed to fall between 2 and 3 years of serving. So serving for nearly 2 years is fairly typical, I would say. There have been,
But I would say for serving as White House press secretary in this environment for President Trump, I mean, my God, I meant Sean Spicer. The job just destroyed him in months, and I don't think anyone thought that Sanders would last 23 months. She probably needs a long break on a beach with some the umbrella drinks and God knows what else, because wow, that is not a job I would wish on anyone. That's a rough job. So that was my first thing that I thought of. But my second thing is, one of the things under Sanders that the press office has been doing is they've basically not so much ended standard kind of media briefings, but they've cut them down to the point where they almost never happen. I think they have the top 2 records for the most months without a news briefing because those things just got so crazy and contentious. And, the president would would say things on Twitter that were demonstrably untrue, and even I think a sympathetic spin would be, well, they're hyperbole, and the press secretary has to not walk them back, because that's not what this administration does, but certainly explain them or contextualize them, if you will, and that got awfully rough in an open forum type of setting, I think.
Right. And you have just so much. There was all this animosity, when Sean Spicer was the press secretary. And actually, just an interesting side note, I've met him and he's lovely. So it's fun. He's actually a very kind of gentle, soft-spoken man, very kind. And, it's funny because I walked away from meeting him thinking, like, how did you do that? He's just too nice. And, Sarah Sanders, I've never met her, in full disclosure, but I would think you would have to be tough as nails to be able to defend some of the things. And just, again, I can't stress enough, like, just how vile some of the back and forth became, and I blame everybody for that. I don't think it was, a lot of people pointed the finger that, they personally attacked Sarah Sanders, on many different occasions. And so, I guess the bottom line is that as a mom, I totally understand. You just want to go home and chill with your kids and be a mom. And, she's been in the public eye since like 03, 04, helping her father and, helping other candidates. So, this is a long time coming. I think 6 months ago, I was starting to say to people like, man, I can't believe she's still there. I like her. I admire her, her feistiness. But man, you can only keep that up for so long. So yeah, a little sad to see her go, but, there's a lot of speculation about who will fill her place. I know Stephanie Grisham has been discussed as somebody who may fill her spot. So big shoes to fill.
It's a big job for sure.
Oh, for sure. And then something that's a little more contentious, I guess, is that the Office of the Special Counsel, which I should note is not in any way related to Robert Mueller, because I know there were some bloggers that got in trouble for saying it had something to do with Robert Mueller. It didn't. They sent a report this week, I think it was Thursday, to President Trump, explaining that his top aide, or one of his top aides, Kellyanne Conway, repeatedly violated the Hatch Act, which we've been talking about for a while in relation to Kellyanne Conway. And this is primarily due to her criticism of Democratic presidential candidates while serving in her official capacity as a White House official. And so there's been all this debate recently about, whether the Hatch Act should apply and whether it, actually does infringe upon these employees' First Amendment rights. And I don't know.
Well, the first thing I did when I heard about this is I pulled up the actual text of the Hatch Act.
Yeah, I did
thought
too.
It would be a good idea to read that. So because a lot of times, they just you get these summaries. And I want to go right to the source. And what jumped out at me is the part that said a federal employee may not use their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the result of an election. Now, It seems to me just patently obvious that, of course, Kellyanne Conway has done this on numerous occasions. Now, that doesn't mean, and I think this is important, you can't do that in your official capacity.
Right.
And, I think Conway is trying to make this, they're trying to silence me, and the president's saying the same thing. That's simply not the case. It's just you can't do that when you are acting in your official capacities. That means your official Twitter account, or when you're going on the air as an official representative of the administration on her own. The real Kellyanne Conway, or whatever her Twitter account is, I guess she could do that and it would be fine, but not officially. And pretty clearly, nothing's going to happen. Conway herself, I love her response to this. Well, love makes me angry, and I love it in a way, just the chutzpah of it. She said, blah, blah, blah. If you're going to trying to silence me through the Hatch Act, it's not going to work. Let me know when the jail sentence starts. It's like, wow, that's the
most Kellyanne response I've ever heard.
That's why Donald Trump loves her,
Yes.
But to me, that's part of the problem, is that these boundaries are just being cut into more and more. And there is a big difference between acting officially and acting as a private citizen. And I think I think she is clearly in violation and nothing's going to happen. And I think that's an unfortunate thing.
Yeah, just, I mean, two quick points that I had kind of jotted down that I wanted to mention about this. So the first thing is that a lot of people are talking about this like this is something new. And of course, while this office has never officially recommended that a president do anything about it. So that's relatively unprecedented. This is not the first time that an executive employee has been in trouble for this. And this is something I think, again, a lot of people forget. They point fingers and say, this is just her. And I keep saying, well, no. So I did the research. So this happened twice, at least twice, under President Obama's administration with HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius. And then the one I remember a little better was HUD Secretary Julian Castro talking about, I think he was talking about Hillary Clinton. So, it has happened. It also happened under President Bush's administration. So this is something that's affected both parties and the presidencies going back at least 10, 15 years. I mean, this has been something that's come up and certainly before that. I mean, it was enacted the Hatch Act was enacted in 1939, I believe. So I'm sure that, a lot
been
of
around for a while.
Yeah, a lot of these employees have run afoul of it. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that this is sort of what happens if you are hiring people, that you're sort of cherry picking these people straight from your campaign. I mean, she managed his campaign, and again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. President Trump is somebody who really puts a high premium on loyalty, and she's obviously loyal. I mean, at the expense of her personal life, she's loyal to this president,
Yeah.
But it's, I think it's worth considering that, she comes from a campaign background. She's a pollster. And this isn't somebody who, this is not an excuse for what she did. I mean, I definitely think there's a clear violation of the Hatch Act going on. But, this is somebody who, comes from this very different background. And so I think it will be something we will have to revisit, whether or not this does sort of infringe upon their, these employees' First Amendment rights. And this is something that's come up again and again on both sides. But I do think at some point we will have to revisit it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, the Twitter issue comes up a lot because late in 2018, the same Office of Special Counsel found, I believe it was 6 other White House officials in violation for using official Twitter accounts to do messages supporting President Trump. And so obviously when the Hatch Act was passed in the 30s, no one was thinking about Twitter accounts. And so that's, maybe we need to revisit that. And there needs to be some sort of official policy about specifically use of social media just to make it absolutely crystal clear.
Right. And then, of course, there comes the issue of, you can support a candidate in your private life. So, for example, like putting a bumper sticker on your personal car would be okay. But, and I think that's another question, because a lot of these people have these Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts, whatever, in these official capacities. So, would they be able to, because they do have this influence and they do have this name recognition on their personal page, would they be able to put, Trump 2020 or, whoever it was, Hillary Clinton 2016, whatever. So I don't know, lots of questions coming up for the Supreme Court, probably.
Definitely. Well, I guess that pretty much does it for us this week, right, Kristen?
I think so.
Really does it, because, of course, I was going to say, no, that's not right, because
we're
when
not
we're
over.
done,
We're not done.
yeah, when we're done here, we're going to do the bonus show. And I think this week, and this is for Patreon supporters, I think we're going to be talking about, what is it? President Trump, those comments he made about opposition research from foreign countries, that maybe that's just a fine thing to get. Well, anyway, we'll get into that. But also, and you wanted to talk a little bit about Jim Acosta, right?
I did. Yeah, he has a book. He published a book, and he's made some pretty he said some pretty wild things about his view on journalism, which has, lit a lot of fires, as definitely. He does a lot. So
so we'll talk about that. The book, The Enemy of the People. I love the title. But so if you're a supporter, that should be in your podcast app by the time you hear this. And of course, that's just one of the supporters only things we've got for you. And if you want to check out any of that stuff, it's patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that with at mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we're also on Twitter at politicsguys. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to the show yet, it really helps us out. We would appreciate it. Word of mouth, always appreciated. Leaving reviews, all that kind of stuff. That would be great. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show was produced by Kristen Matheny and Michael Baranowski. That's me. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.